London, 1887. Thick, morning fog covered the streets as horse-drawn carriages rolled over wet stone roads. Rich ladies walked into expensive shops wearing elegant dresses, while poor workers hurried toward factories before sunrise. On one quiet street lived 22-year-old Clara Bennett, a talented seamstress. Every day she worked inside a small dress shop owned by an elderly widow named Mrs. Ellis. Clara was known for her gentle smile and her extraordinary skill with a needle and thread. She could repair torn coats so perfectly that no one could see the old damage. She dreamed of opening her own dress shop one day, but money was always scarce. Even so, she believed that kindness and hard work would eventually change her life. One rainy afternoon, Mrs. Ellis handed Clara a carefully wrapped package. "This must be delivered to Ashcroft Manor before sunset," she said. "It is the new evening coat for the Duke." Clara had never visited one of London's grand mansions before. She carefully carried the package through the busy streets until she reached enormous iron gates. Beautiful gardens surrounded a magnificent stone mansion. A butler welcomed her inside while servants hurried through wide halls decorated with paintings and crystal chandeliers. As Clara waited quietly, she heard loud voices coming from another room. "You must marry Lady Eleanor," an older man demanded. "The families have already agreed." Another calm voice answered, "I will not marry someone I do not love." Clara accidentally glanced toward the doorway. A tall young gentleman stood there wearing a dark Victorian suit. His serious grey eyes met hers for only a moment before the older man noticed her presence. "Who is this?" the man asked sharply. "The seamstress delivering your evening coat, sir," the butler replied. The older man frowned impatiently. "Leave it and go." Clara quickly placed the package on the table and hurried away. As she reached the front steps, someone called after her. "Miss!" She turned. It was the young gentleman from inside. "You forgot your umbrella," he said, holding it toward her. Clara smiled. "Thank you." The gentleman smiled back. "My name is Edward Ashcroft." Clara's eyes widened. "You're the Duke." Edward nodded with a friendly smile. "And you're the talented seamstress who made my new coat." Clara laughed nervously. "I only helped finish it." Edward looked at the careful stitching. "Then you have remarkable talent." Before either could continue, the older man appeared behind Edward. His cold eyes rested on Clara. "Edward," he said firmly. "Your guests are waiting." Edward politely nodded. "Perhaps we'll meet again." Clara curtsied before leaving, never expecting those words to come true. During the following weeks, Edward found reasons to visit Mrs. Ellis's little shop. Sometimes he brought an old coat needing repair. Sometimes he ordered new gloves. Sometimes he simply walked past the window. Clara soon realized that he always stayed longer than necessary. They began talking about books, music, gardens, and London itself. Edward surprised her by speaking kindly to everyone, whether they were servants, workers, or wealthy gentlemen. Clara admired that about him. Edward admired Clara's honesty. She never treated him differently because of his title. One evening, Edward invited Mrs. Ellis and Clara to a charity concert supporting poor children. Mrs. Ellis smiled knowingly. "My old knees aren't made for long concerts." "Clara, you should go instead." Clara hesitated but finally accepted. The concert hall glowed with hundreds of candles. Beautiful music filled the room. During the performance, Edward quietly whispered, "Whenever life becomes difficult, music reminds me that beauty still exists." Clara smiled softly. "I feel the same way about sewing." After the concert, they walked through Hyde Park, beneath the moonlight. They laughed easily together. For the first time in years, Edward forgot the pressure of noble duties. Clara forgot the worries of unpaid bills. Yet someone watched them from a distance. His name was Lord Victor Blackwood. Victor was wealthy, ambitious, and respected by London's highest society. Outwardly he appeared charming and generous. In truth, he cared only about power and money. For years he had planned to marry Lady Eleanor and strengthen his influence over Britain's richest families. Edward's refusal threatened those plans. When Victor saw Edward smiling beside a poor seamstress, an idea slowly formed in his mind. The next morning Victor visited Ashcroft Manor. "Edward," he said pleasantly, "I hear you've become quite interested in a seamstress." Edward answered calmly, "She is an intelligent and kind woman." Victor laughed quietly. Kindness does not impress Parliament. Imagine the newspapers if Britain's youngest duke married a shop girl. Edward remained silent. Victor stepped closer. "Think carefully. Society is not as forgiving as your heart." Edward simply replied, "I care more about truth than gossip." Victor smiled politely, but inside he was furious. If Edward would not be controlled by pride, then fear would have to do the job. Several days later, Mrs. Ellis received an enormous order from Lady Eleanor's household. It was the largest order the little shop had ever received. Dresses, coats, gloves, and formal gowns all needed to be completed before an important royal banquet. Clara worked late into the night with excitement. This single order could keep the shop open for another year. Unknown to anyone, Victor secretly paid one dishonest servant to replace the expensive silk fabric with damaged cloth. When the finished dresses arrived at Lady Eleanor's mansion, the fabric began tearing almost immediately. Lady Eleanor became embarrassed before several important guests. She angrily cancelled every order. News spread through London within hours. "Mrs. Ellis's shop sells poor quality clothing," people whispered. Customers stopped visiting. Bills piled higher each week. Mrs. Ellis sat silently inside the empty shop, staring at unpaid letters. "We're ruined," she whispered sadly. Clara refused to believe it. "Someone did this on purpose," Mrs. Ellis sighed. "Perhaps. But who would care enough to destroy two poor dressmakers?" Clara did not know the answer. That evening Edward arrived carrying fresh bread and tea. He immediately noticed their worried faces. Clara explained everything. Edward listened carefully before saying quietly, "I've seen this happen before." Clara looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Edward lowered his voice. "Someone wanted your reputation destroyed." Clara looked directly into his eyes. "Who?" Edward hesitated. "I don't know yet." In truth, he already suspected Victor Blackwood. But suspicion was not proof. Without evidence, accusing a respected lord could destroy his own reputation as well. Edward promised to help them. Together they began searching for anyone connected to the ruined fabric. Days passed with no answers. Then one cold evening, Clara finished cleaning the shop after sunset. As she locked the front door, she noticed a frightened young servant waiting across the street. He nervously looked around before running toward her. "Miss Bennet," he whispered, "I know who ruined the dresses." Clara's heart began beating faster. "Who?" The servant looked over his shoulder in fear. "I cannot speak here." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Meet me tomorrow night at the old railway warehouse. I'll tell you everything." Before Clara could ask another question, the servant hurried away into the thick London fog. Hidden across the street, Lord Victor Blackwood quietly watched the entire meeting from inside his waiting carriage. A slow smile appeared on his face. "Poor boy," he whispered. "He has just signed his own fate." The following evening, a thick fog covered London streets as Clara carefully walked toward the old railway warehouse. She pulled her coat tightly around herself. Every sound made her heart beat faster. The streets were almost empty. Only the distant sound of horses and church bells broke the silence. When she reached the warehouse, she looked around nervously. "Hello?" she called softly. No one answered. Then she noticed someone lying beside a wooden crate. It was the young servant. He was alive, but badly injured. Clara quickly hurried to him. "What happened?" she cried. The frightened servant slowly opened his eyes. They found out I wanted to tell you the truth." Clara knelt beside him. "Who?" The young man struggled to speak. "Lord Victor Blackwood." Before he could continue, several footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Clara quickly helped the servant hide behind the crates. 3 large men entered carrying lanterns. "Search everywhere," one of them ordered. "The boy must not speak to anyone," Clara covered, her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. The servant whispered, "Please, don't let them find me." Just then another voice came from the warehouse entrance. "Looking for someone?" It was Edward. He stepped inside with 2 trusted servants from Ashcroft Manor. The hired men immediately ran toward the back door, but Edward's servants stopped them before they could escape. Within minutes, the men were tied up. Edward hurried to Clara. "Are you all right?" Clara nodded with relief. "Yes, but he needs a doctor." Edward carefully helped the injured servant stand. Before losing consciousness, the young man handed Edward a folded letter hidden inside his coat. "Keep this safe." The next morning, the doctor confirmed that the servant would recover. Edward and Clara carefully opened the letter. Inside was a written confession. It explained how Lord Victor had secretly paid money to replace the fine silk with damaged cloth. The servant had watched everything but had been too frightened to speak until now. Edward looked at Clara. "This is the proof we needed." Clara smiled for the first time in many days. "Then Mrs. Ellis's name can finally be cleared." Edward nodded. "Yes, but Victor will not surrender easily. They were right." When Victor learned that the servant was still alive, he became furious. He immediately visited several powerful nobles, trying to convince them that Edward had invented the story to protect a poor seamstress. Rumors spread through London's highest society once again. Some believed Edward. Others believed Victor. Soon the matter reached the attention of the Lord Chancellor, who announced that both men would present their evidence before a formal public hearing. News spread across the city. Newspapers called it the greatest scandal of the season. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was crowded with noble families, journalists, and curious citizens. Clara had never seen so many important people in one place. Her hands trembled as she entered beside Mrs. Ellis. Edward quietly whispered, "Don't be afraid." Clara smiled weakly. "I'm trying." Lord Victor stood confidently before the judges. "This entire story," he declared, "is nothing more than a desperate attempt to protect a failing business." Several nobles nodded in agreement. Then Edward calmly stepped forward. "I ask the court to hear one witness before making its decision." The injured servant slowly entered the room. Everyone became silent. The young man bravely described everything he had seen. He explained how Victor had ordered the silk replaced and had later sent men to stop him from telling the truth. Finally, Edward presented the signed confession. The courtroom fell completely silent. Victor's face turned pale. "He's lying," Victor shouted. "He's been paid." The judge calmly examined the letter. "This confession carries your steward's official seal." Another servant from Victor's own house stood up unexpectedly. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I can also confirm these events." Victor stared at him in disbelief. "You traitor!" The servant lowered his head. "No, my lord. I simply grew tired of living with lies." After a long discussion, the judges announced their decision. Lord Victor Blackwood was found guilty of fraud, intimidation, and attempting to destroy the reputation of innocent people. His titles and influence were greatly reduced, and he was ordered to repay every loss caused by his actions. As guards escorted Victor away, he looked toward Edward with anger. "You may have won today," he said bitterly, "but society will never accept her." Edward answered calmly, "Society changes when good. People refuse to fear it." Courtroom erupted into quiet applause. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Edward and Clara. "Your Grace," one journalist asked, "is it true that you intend to marry a seamstress?" Edward smiled without hesitation. "No." Clara looked surprised. The reporters began writing quickly. Then Edward continued, "I intend to marry the bravest, kindest, and most honest woman I have ever known. Her profession has never mattered to me." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Every reporter fell silent. Edward gently turned toward her. "Clara Bennett, from the first day you walked into Ashcroft Manor, carrying nothing but a simple package and a warm smile, my life changed. You showed me that true worth is measured by character, not by birth. Will you do me the greatest honor of becoming my wife?" The entire crowd waited quietly. Clara smiled through happy tears. "Yes." Cheers echoed across the street. Even strangers began clapping. Mrs. Ellis wiped tears from her eyes while laughing happily. Several months later, London celebrated one of the happiest weddings anyone could remember. Clara wore a beautiful ivory gown that she had designed herself with. Mrs. Ellis, Edward, waited for her beneath the flowers of the old church where sunlight streamed through colorful stained glass windows. As Clara walked toward him, she remembered every difficult moment that had brought them there. She had almost lost everything, yet kindness had carried her through every storm. After the ceremony, Edward surprised everyone with another announcement. He had purchased a beautiful building in London for Mrs. Ellis and Clara. "This," he said with a smile, "will become the finest dress shop in the city." Clara hugged the elderly widow tightly. Mrs. Ellis laughed through her tears. "I always knew those clever hands of yours would change your life." Years later, women from across Britain travelled to Clara's famous shop. Some came because her dresses were beautiful. Others came because they had heard the story of the seamstress who married a duke without ever changing the kindness in her heart. Whenever young apprentices asked Clara the secret of her success, she always smiled and gave the same answer. Talent may open one door, courage opens the next, but kindness keeps every door open, forever. Edward would always smile whenever he heard those words, because he knew they were true. Together they proved that love could be stronger than pride, stronger than lies, and stronger than the walls that society sometimes built between people. Long after their story became part of London's history, people still remembered the young duke who chose love over status, and the humble seamstress whose gentle heart changed not only one man's life, but the hearts of an entire city.